Good morning, conference. What I'm going to do is speak for about 20 minutes or so and then throw it open for questions. But I'm also just happy to receive your advice, your challenges, your points, because we are in a stage now of the build in NCA where a number of people who are here have attended workshops and are closely engaged. But this time next year we'll be very close to starting operating. So it's really important to me to pick up any advice or points that you want to make. So I'm going to give up as much of the session as I can to listening to you and answering your questions. So please get involved. I'm absolutely delighted to come and speak to you today. My job as Director General of the NCA is to develop a visible crime fighting agency that will not operate in isolation. I'm not talking about some sort of British FBI. I've never called it that. I don't think anyone has, apart from some people in the media have chosen to characterise it in that way. This is not a remote organisation that sort of rolls into town and picks up all responsibilities on serious organised and complex crime. The operating model absolutely depends on our relationships with you in policing and wider law enforcement. The whole operating model is predicated on us working together in a collaborative and cohesive way and aligning our resources properly against the most serious threats. We'll have a broad remit. The legislation has been drawn deliberately widely, but our starting point is we'll lead on organised crime, child exploitation, border policing, economic crime, and cyber. There are other issues that we may be leading on by day one, so there's a conversation going on about protected persons, ballistics intelligence, prison intelligence. There's a whole range of other things that we're considering. And in due course, and the legislation has been future-proofed, there'll be a debate and a review, I think, about the future of CT policing. That will happen in due course. No decisions have been made, but you'll get a sense that we're starting with a number of threats, but this is a very clear commitment from government to say the bit of public protection that's best done locally is best done locally, that's best done nationally should be done nationally. And that's the mission, to create an agency that does that as best as it possibly can. We'll be operational by the end of 2013. The target date is the 1st of October 2013. That may well seem like a long way off, and I've been in this job now for about 9 months. If you get a full understanding of the work that needs to be done, not only in terms of bringing together a number of other organisations like Serious Organised Crime Agency, Child Exploitation Online Protection Centre, some parts of the Met, some parts of NPIA, and others in due course. It's a lot of work to do to not only bring those organisations together, but also make sure we've got our partnerships and our arrangements in the right place, because, as I say, the operating model depends on that. A lot of you in this room have already been involved in regional workshops. I've got to say I've really appreciated the contribution of superintendents. You are the most senior operational leaders day to day. I don't think it's only the responsibility of police chiefs to articulate how policing should be delivered and some of the risks and challenges that we face. I think that absolutely falls to your association and others. But you've been a really important part of all the regional workshops, and your ideas have fed in and shaped how the agency is being developed. I'm really clear that providing full and frank feedback from me and from you and getting an honest conversation going is important, and that's only the way in which we'll build the sort of agency that we all want to see. So, what I hope to do this morning is to set out a bit more detail about why we need the NCA. Some of you will say, well, I already knew that. Some colleagues may benefit from hearing a bit more about why it's so important, because one of the real challenges I've got is making sure the NCA is understood and relevant, not just the professionals in this room, but PCCs and communities. And I think in some ways we have failed to engage communities and to explain fully why organised crime in its broadest sense, not just serious organised crime, is hugely relevant. And what it turns on for me is that the reality is geographic boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, agency boundaries, police force boundaries are absolutely irrelevant to organised crime. And when I talk about organised crime in its broadest sense, child exploitation, cyber, all of the threats that we're going to be responsible for. In fact, it could be argued, if you have a good understanding of how organised crime groups operate, they actually exploit those geographic and organisational boundaries. So one would imagine that every time somebody who's involved in organised crime interacts with a state, whether it's submitting a tax return, whether it's social services involving their kids, whether it's paying for their TV licence or it's with law enforcement, that should always present an opportunity for us to target some of the most dangerous criminals. And that's absolutely where we need to get to. But of course, it's not quite that simple when you're talking about such a broad range of organisations and interactions. The principle that needs to absolutely underpin what NCA stands for is public protection. That's what's going to underpin the decisions that I make. It needs to underpin how our success is judged. It needs to underpin the sort of people that we want to recruit and how we develop those people within our organisations. But importantly, it needs to reflect our relationships. And I do need to make NCA relevant to the officers and staff that work for you, because the reality is we do need that local to global response where neighbourhood teams have a responsibility, people working in partnerships with local authorities, for instance, have a responsibility, but NCA needs to bring that absolutely high-end specialist capability, whether it's international reach, whether it's use of covert techniques. We need to bring that as well, and it needs to come together into a well-aligned pattern of work that at the moment sometimes is not as aligned as it might be. In fact, I would say on occasions, the reason why it works is more of a happy accident where relationships are good. And I think when we're talking about threats such as organised crime, frankly, that isn't good enough. And that's the real challenge. To get out of this being a happy accident based on good relationships and individual operations, to get it into a way of working. That's the real challenge. A couple of things that I wanted to deal with up front, I think some misconceptions. NCA is not soccer rebadged. It's not soccer rebadged for a number of reasons. One, soccer has never been asked, no law enforcement agency has ever been asked to lead the overall response to serious organised and complex crime. That's the job we've been given. Soccer is a law enforcement agency that sits alongside your forces and others. Our responsibility is to lead the overall response. Now that could look like us undertaking a specific operation, so where we're in the lead. It could look like us supporting an operation that your force is leading, so that could look like telephone interception, covert entry, international reach, cyber, could look like a whole range of capabilities, or it could look like coordination, where frankly what needs to happen sometimes, we need to put people in touch with each other, make sure that intelligence is being properly shared and get the investigation lined up. There's been a recent example, and given it's an open conference I can't say too much, but there's been a recent example of a group of people committing very high value burglaries, underpinned with a great deal of violence and intimidation, where they're offended in 15 different force areas. And we got a number of incident rooms in different places that just simply weren't joined up. But the reality is, if we can bring that join up, if we can explain to people the benefits and make sure the intelligence is shared, it means that we're going to investigate criminals much more effectively than we have been. There's some other things I'm going to say as well about why it isn't soccer rebadged. Beyond, there are other organisations coming in, and it's a broader set of threats where soccer at the moment focuses on serious organised crime. You'll understand NCA has a broader remit. But there's a bit I'm going to say later on just about what a different sort of organisation it will be. NCA won't be secretive. It seems to me that if you accept that the operating model depends on relationships, I don't know how we build a relationship with you, your officers, your staff, your organisations, the public that you protect, if we're secretive. The public are trusting us, as they are you, with coercive powers, power to arrest, intrusive powers, power to use covert techniques, and they're trusting us with several £100 million of their money. So I think they need to know who we are and how well we're doing. There'll be operational reasons, as there are for you, why sometimes we can't tell everyone everything, and we need to be thoughtful about it. But to be clear, NCA will be a well-understood, recognised, open organisation, and the way that we work with you will be a huge shift from how national agencies have worked previously with the police, where you will know what we're doing, you will know who we're targeting, you will know what intelligence we've got. It's a real shift. At an appropriate level, of course. We're not going to put it in the papers, but we need to work through that in a very different way. NCA won't be a desk-bound coordinating body. First and foremost, I don't think the Home Secretary could have been clearer about this, it's an operational crime-fighting body where the work that we do will be visible at every level. We're not going to replicate what you and your officers and staff do. You're better at that than we will be. So our primary role in life will not be spending every day kicking in doors for street drug dealers. Of course not. But if there's a reason that you need us there because of something that we can bring, or you need some support, or you need surge capacity, then of course we're there to support you. But what we really bring is specialist, high-level capabilities that in England and Wales we wouldn't want to replicate 43 times, and we certainly wouldn't want 52 times across the whole of the UK, and that's before we talk about national agencies. Finally, a really important point, which I think probably as a service, as well as from an NCA point of view, is hugely important. That's around prosperity. Organised crime alone, that's serious organised crime, costs the UK economy somewhere between 20 and 40 billion pounds a year. Now that loss from our economy means less money for public services. It means our country becomes an attractive place to do business. That's clearly got implications for employment and some of the issues that come with that for you and the communities that you protect. So prosperity is an important part of what we need to do as well. Prime Minister's been very clear. He expects us to make an impact on economic crime, for instance, which is a huge problem, and if we're not careful, can make the UK an unattractive place to do business. That's absolutely not what we want. So we need to tackle some of those very difficult threats, some of those that often are beyond the reach of normal law enforcement techniques, and frankly, we need to be better at preventing as well as bringing to justice. Let me outline a few things that I want NCA to do differently. There's a perception, you may say it's a reality, but there's a perception in some places that when soccer started off, it operated more like an intelligence agency, with a security posture that reflected that. The nature of the relationships, some would say, reflected that approach. That's absolutely not what we're about. I've said plenty about openness, but to be clear, our security posture, the way we do our relationships, will be about law enforcement. We are a law enforcement body, and that's the way in which we'll operate. One of the big changes to help us deliver our coordination role is there are a set of provisions in the bill, and all of this is subject to the wishes of Parliament, of course, that enable us to ask police forces and wider law enforcement to undertake particular tasks that we, working with you, have decided need to be undertaken. There's also a provision that in certain circumstances, but I'm clear this is in extreme circumstances, we can task police forces in England and Wales. That's quite a big shift. You'll understand how that's a big shift constitutionally. You'll understand how it's a big shift operationally. I am clear that's in extremis, but I'm equally as clear that we do need the power, and that'll come out in some of the things I'm going to say about drugs markets in a minute. What we do need, though, is to make sure that we have productive relationships, because I do think we can get most of what we need to get done if we've got a joined-up intelligence picture, something we've never had, if we've got the right arrangements in place and we're all focused, and make sure that we work together in a collaborative way to tackle some of the most dangerous individuals and groups. That's where we need to be. But I think it is important that in extreme circumstances, the best solution doesn't always suit everyone, and we do need to be in a position to get some things done. Of course, who leads on an operation will always depend on the circumstances. So, of course, if, and every neighbourhood has, it would be highly unlikely that a police force in the north would want to instigate a relatively speculative surveillance operation at a port in the south. Why would you want to do that? Equally, it could be argued that it's quite challenging for a force in the south to mount a surveillance operation at a port when the commodity, if it's drugs, isn't going to stop within their force area, it's just going to transit through that force area and go elsewhere. But of course, the reality is we all need to join up in some of this, and actually sometimes there are difficult choices to be made. The important thing about how we line up the response is we've got a system of 43 forces in England and Wales, we've got a number of national agencies, we all have part of the solution, and sometimes difficult choices need to be made about how we line that up. And frankly, I don't think we've been good enough at that. So we need to think differently about how we're going to work together, and hopefully in some of the things that you'll say to me when I've finished speaking, you can give me some advice about how we're going to do that. To be clear, we absolutely do need to do it, because organised crime doesn't respect any of those boundaries that we sometimes obsess about. And in some cases, particularly if it's cyber-enabled, you don't even need to open your front door to get the threat into your house. That ends up with your children being exploited, you losing your savings, or whatever. So let's be clear, we need to think in a different way, and that is a real challenge for us, because it will mean sometimes undertaking activities in a joined-up way which might not make sense if seen in isolation. Let's be clear, if we think about drugs, you'll have your own view if you're running a geographic command about what level of violence, acquisitive crime, antisocial behaviour, the impact on people trafficking, prostitution, what impact all of that comes from organised crime. And we need to tackle it, but just doing it in the neighbourhood, frankly, won't make the difference that we all need to see. There's also a logic to the role that we bring. Again, if you use drugs as an example, but we could use a whole range of things. If the way in which we attempt to deal with Class A drugs, and let's remember all Class A drugs cross an international border and then transit probably through many force areas before they're cut and distributed. If the way that we seek to deal with that is a long way away from the source at street level, let's just be clear, at a time when there's pressure on public resources across the whole landscape, that is not a very good way of using resources. In fact, the use of resources grows exponentially. Whereas actually, if we're working at source or in transit countries or at point of entry, that's a lot more efficient. So when you think about the response that you can bring in policing and how that can be joined up, that's why the work that we need to do and the contribution we can make actually is good for your resources as well. The closer we can tackle problems to the source, the better for all of us. Much of what I'm talking about is in effect a two-way deal. We've got a role to perform around leading and coordinating the overall law enforcement response. That does mean as leading operations, it does mean as supporting you, it does mean a level of coordination, and on occasions, in extreme circumstances, direction. There's also provisions in the bill about information sharing, and it places a much stronger duty on policing and law enforcement and the NCA to make sure that we share information in a more constructive way. I think the biggest challenge that we face in building the NCA is the intelligence hub. But unless we start to see information sharing as something that's a really good thing to do and to be positive about it and comply with our duties that are set out in the bill, we are going to be struggles. I think in some places in law enforcement there's still a view that information shared is an opportunity lost. And that's absolutely not how we can operate. Unless we can start to talk and task and agree what we're going to do against a single coherent intelligence picture, I think we're going to really struggle. There's no point in us having 52 or 152. We'll never make decisions that make sense. But to have a coherent intelligence picture, we've got to share our intelligence and we've got to join up and talk with confidence about the picture that's developed. Two more things I want to say about the NCA. Needs to be more of a 24/7 organisation than I would perceive the precursors have been. I think your officers and staff are just as likely to need something from us at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning as 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. So that's going to be quite a shift for national agencies. Not everyone on shift patterns, that isn't what you need from us. But we do need to be much more responsive, and some of the features you'd expect in a law enforcement agency, like a single point of entry into the organisation, proper command and control, a senior person on duty in the workplace to decide how we're going to respond to your requests, are all very important features of what we need to do. We are going through a period of intense change across the whole of policing, law enforcement, and actually public service, and you'll be affected by much of that. And I guess many of you in the room, and I've been through some of this as well, go back to National Drugs Intelligence Unit, NSIS, Crime Squad, now SOCA, and we'll say, well, is this just a different version of what's gone before? And I've been through this. The level of ambition there is at the moment to bring a proper, coherent national response that joins up effectively with the local, probably through regional, and we need to think about how we're going to develop the regional as a sensible platform for us to interact nationally through to the local. The level of ambition is absolutely huge, and I think that's right. There are some challenges, because we've got resource challenges the same as you have, but this really is a step change. The ability to have an agency in place that can properly lead the response rather than just join you as another law enforcement agency. If we're going to have a local system as we have, with local democratic accountability, we do need a law enforcement agency that can bridge across all of that. One of the things that I would ask you to do, and your officers and staff to do, is we do need to try and bust this myth that serious organised crime is something that happens targeted just against big corporations and the normal man or woman in the street isn't affected. The reality is we're all victims of serious organised crime every single day. You know, whether it's about what happens to our bank account, you know, the risk of our children in their bedroom rather than outside the school gates when they're on social networking sites. We've got to bring this alive for communities in a way where people don't associate impact of organised crime just with whether there's people outside their front door with guns or not. That's hugely damaging, hugely important, but the impact of organised crime is much broader, much deeper than that, and it's affecting us all the time. And when you're speaking to communities, I really need you to help me bring that alive. Because one of the things that I do know is the partnership with the public for us is going to be very different. No, we won't have front offices in the way that you do. No, I don't think people will generally be ringing us to report crime in the way that they do with you. Say for economic crime, there might be some different approaches. But we do need to have the confidence of the public that there is in place a coherent system, both their local law enforcement, but also nationally, and it all joins up effectively. So please try and bring the threat alive with communities and speak about how we're trying to develop an overall response, because people need to have confidence that we're getting a grip of what is a very difficult problem. I could give you lots of examples of success over recent years. I could give you lots of promises about what we're going to deliver in the future. But the key thing that I want to convey to you is the importance of the relationship and the join-up and how we work together. And that's why I need your advice and your contribution for how we might do that. The key theme that runs through everything is using our resources better to target contemporary threats to public safety, rather than necessarily thinking always in traditional ways. So law enforcement for us can't just mean bringing people to justice, as important as that is, and as much of a focus as that's going to be. We have to think differently about how we disrupt organised crime. We started to appoint senior people now. You will know some of them. Trevor Pearce, who's currently the Director General of Serious Organised Crime Agency, has been appointed into a director role in NCA. Peter Davis, who's the Chief Executive of CEOP, has been appointed into a director role, albeit his job will be re-advertised in the spring when his secondment as a Deputy Chief Constable comes to an end. And we're out for advert at the moment for a Director of Organised Crime and Economic Crime. What will happen in due course is we'll start to open up those opportunities even more widely than we have. The precursors have vacancies. I want to grab those vacancies and make sure that we recruit the right people. One of the blockages that there has been, I think, for people to join the police, to join NCA from the police, for police officers, has been the police pension. It may be the key blocker. The bill does make a provision that I can designate posts or groups of posts that would be suitable for someone who got a job through an open competition to remain part of the police pension scheme. One of the ambitions, and I'll make no secret of this, is to make sure that we get some of the very, very talented people out of policing and into the NCA, and some of the very talented people we're inheriting from precursor organisations into policing as well. Because I think that cross-flow of people is a very good thing for us to do, and I think the police pensions issue should be resolved subject to the views of Parliament. So please watch this space for opportunities as we move forward, because I do want to recruit the very best people. Much of what I've said is dependent on the views of Parliament, but you probably didn't follow it, but obviously I did. The bill has reached virtually the end of its passage through the Lords. We've got the report stage to go in the autumn. And the debates were largely about governance, so the one-to-one relationship between the Director General of NCA and the Home Secretary. There are issues about tasking and how that works with police and crime commissioners. Child protection, that was another issue. But one thing that was very clear to me in what all of the Lords said, irrespective of political party or being a crossbencher, was they all supported the need for the NCA. Now, when we go into the Commons, quite properly there'll be a robust debate about a whole range of issues within the bill. But my sense is that this is an issue that people recognise is of its day and is absolutely necessary, and we need to make it fly. So my ambition is to develop a national agency that protects the public, but by working in partnership with you and wider law enforcement and the officers and staff that work for you. So hopefully you now know a little bit more. I'm going to throw it open now, and I think we've probably got about 35 minutes. I am happy just to receive your advice and your points as well as your questions, because it is still very important, and we're nowhere near the end of the work that we need to do.
Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, while we're getting the microphones assembled, just a couple of thoughts for myself. You said, Keith, that obviously this is going to demand cooperation from everyone involved, but you also said that there'll be situations where you have to task forces, in other words, put it less politely perhaps, direct chief officers. That's going to lead to problems, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think if we work hard at having the right operational models in place, we share intelligence appropriately, and we make joined up sensible decisions about protecting the public, which happens a lot as it is. I think the added value of a national agency is making sure that's properly coordinated. I really think it'll be in extreme circumstances if we need to task. And frankly, something has gone wrong somewhere in the system if that's what we need to do. And the chief constables that I'm speaking to all agree with that point, that yes, we understand why the power is needed, but let's work hard to make sure that we're joined up in a way which means it's never necessary.
Doesn't sit very comfortably, though, does it, with the sort of government's notion that they want to give more local accountability, not just in the police force, obviously, but across the whole spectrum of society?
Well, that's half of the commitment, but there's another half as well, which is to make sure that national level crime threats, which impact on every neighbourhood, are properly tackled. And I think if we have 43 different approaches to doing that, and 43 lots of decision making about which groups and individuals we're going to target, I don't see how we're going to deliver on the second part of the commitment, which is to make sure that we tackle national level threats. So it's absolutely resolvable. It can work very effectively. Later today, I'm going to speak again to a group of prospective police and crime commissioners. The 60 or 70 that I spoke to and Hugh spoke to as well only a few months ago absolutely got the importance of this. They don't want their officers and staff working abroad. They expect us to deliver that. They don't want to invest in telephone interception. They want us to do that. And they do recognise that, and drugs is always a good example, many of the things that PCCs will have committed to in their manifesto are driven by drugs markets and organised crime more generally.
Just before we go to the question at the back there, you don't like the analogy with the FBI, but nevertheless it's been made probably by people like myself in the media. But just bearing that in mind, the relationship, as I understand it anyway, between the New York police and the FBI is not always the happiest. Does that not cause you some nervousness?
Perhaps that's why we don't want a model where we have some sort of federal-based agencies and state and local agencies. The reality is this is one national agency working in partnership with local and other national agencies to join up the response. It's not a competition. We're all on the same side.
Okay. Let's go to our questioner at the back. Stand up if you would. Thank you. Tell us who you are and on the point or question you wish to make.
Andrew Miller, City of London Police. Keith, the National Lead Force for Economic Crime is in the business now of rolling out regional intelligence and operational economic crime investigation units. How do you see that working with your agency, and is that a model for the future for other specialist areas of investigation?
Mick Creedon's just done a review of regional policing, the aspects that are about organised crime, and I include fraud or economic crime within that. And Mick's come to a range of conclusions, some of which will have very strong support from the service, some of which might be challenged by the service. And that review has now gone to the Home Secretary for her to start to consider how we might move forward. So I'm going to give you a personal view. My personal view is that the way in which we need to interact with policing is mostly at the regional level. I think it's largely for regions to decide how regions want to get things done, so the how, but I think the what needs to be much clearer. What must a region be able to deliver? And I think as part of that, there need to be some specialist capabilities held at a regional level. So whether it's a confidential unit or it's fraud capability, there need to be some capabilities that, frankly, it wouldn't make sense to have 43 confidential units. And in some places like fraud, there are real pressures around resources. So we need some sort of consistent footprint across all of the regions that helps us understand exactly what can be delivered, and some of that needs to be ring-fenced. Now, I think the lead force responsibility that the city have had, they have taken forward very, very well and have moved us on enormously around economic crime. And they're a big part of the Economic Crime Coordination Board that I chair. I don't think we need to fracture any of that, but I do think we need to make sure that it works. So your commissioner is very closely involved in the work that we're doing, and I know his commitment as well is to make sure that we tackle economic crime in the right way. So I think all of that work is developing, but over the coming weeks and months, I think it will become much more certain.
Do you want to come back on that? Are you happy with that? Anybody else in the media? Well, one other issue is the role of terrorism, or what you're going to do with regard to terrorism. There's an article in the Times this morning, apparently, suggesting that senior officers are a little bit uncomfortable with the agency taking over crime. I think the agency is in too embryonic a stage at the moment to tackle such a complex issue, which, as we know, is led by the Met and with the cooperation of other forces as well. What's your response to that?
Well, I haven't seen the article, but based on what you say, on one hand, I absolutely agree, and that I think it's far too embryonic. We don't exist yet. We haven't got an act that creates the organisation. But there will come a time, 1st of October next year, when we will be operational and we will be delivering exactly what I've just said. Now, inevitably, change will continue after that. You can't do everything on day one. My personal view is this isn't about ideology, and I don't think senior police colleagues think it's about ideology either, and I don't think the Home Secretary and ministers think it is. It's about, in the current environment, what's the best way of protecting the public from terrorists, and that's the logical review that we need to go through, and whatever the answer is, it'll be evidence-based, and that's what we should do.
What they're citing in this article, and I haven't seen it until a moment ago either, but what they're citing in this article is the success of the police forces collectively with regard to the Olympics, and say, well, you know, what's the point when we can do it so well with things as they are?
I think it's been a huge success, the Olympics, and I think beyond the Olympics, I think the system that we've got in place across the UK, because of course it is slightly different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but across the whole UK, works very, very well. I don't disagree.
Right.
But now, I think, with the emergence of a national agency, post-Olympics, the nature of the threat, I'm not saying it's getting less, but it might be changing, you know, the world's changing. What's the best way of doing it going forward? But nothing that I would ever say is in any way a criticism of what's gone before. I think colleagues involved in CT have done an exceptional job, and not just through the Olympics.
Stand up, sir, tell me who you are and make your point.
Steve Barry from Sussex. It's a follow-up question to the first question, actually. You said the NCA don't want to fracture the regional arrangements at the moment, but in the context of a lot of the bilateral collaborations, where does the NCA actually come in as the glue to try and fix and try and prevent some of the tensions that are developing through the bilateral arrangements?
Well, I don't think we're going to fix it. One of the things that I've done in the spirit of what I call co-creation, which is developing an agency by working with our partners, is to say to ACPO, how would you like us to interact? And the answer that's come back, DCC Collect Paul from South Wales did the work for ACPO. The answer that's come back is we absolutely want you to work at a regional level. That's where we see the primary join up. That's the interface between the NCA and policing. For some forces that have particularly high levels of risk, and for that you could read the Metropolitan Police, West Midlands Police, Merseyside, Greater Manchester, those sorts of forces would also want a bilateral relationship in place. That's what we expect you to do. Now, we need to work hard at having a whole range of relationships, but what would be very difficult for us is to have, as it is at the moment, 52 police force relationships, a set of sub-regional collaboration relationships, and a set of regional relationships. We'd spend all our time trying to build and maintain relationships. So you can expect a big dollop of common sense about how we work with you based on the needs of an operation, but in terms of day-to-day interaction, I would expect us to be doing that at a regional level, and for those forces that are carrying a very high risk, for us to make sure our relationships are particularly strong with those forces.
You want to go, Mark, on that road? No, you haven't. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Tell us who you are, first of all. There's Mike.
Carl O'Malley from Essex. A question again. I'm kind of going over some ground that in a way you've covered, but some of what you said just made me feel slightly uncomfortable. Within Kent Essex, it's not regional, but we do have a crime unit, a combined unit. I'm just worried about how you're going to interact with that. Will we be treading on some of the same ground? I can see some dangers.
Well, I think we'll have to work it through, but you know, as I've said, we asked ACPO the question, and all forces were surveyed, and forces came back with a range of opinions. What I said to ACPO is, I need to know what your preference is, and that's got implications for how we'll operate. And the preference that's come back is regions, big metropolitan forces. Of course we're going to have some sort of relationship with you, but in terms of day-to-day activity, sharing intelligence, making sure our assessments line up, where we need to operate, I think, is regional level. But you will be able to access our capabilities. We probably, through the region, would expect to be able to access some of your capabilities as well. We just need to work at it. And whatever we need to do to make it work is what we'll do.
Happy? Yes, sir. Tell us who you are. Stand as you will.
I am standing. Good morning, Andy Street from Bedfordshire, but working across beds, cams and hearts in terms of daily bit. My issue is around the tasking and the sort of top-down tasking which you described, but only in extremis. One of the criticisms of some of the old national agencies is that that's fine, but we can never actually task up. We can ask and often get told no. And I'm just wondering if it's possible to build something in that if it's clearly should be tasked up, that it's going to be accepted and taken on.
All of the arrangements, apart from directed tasking of police forces in England and Wales, are reciprocal. So the Home Secretary can direct me to give Bedfordshire assistance. So if you want some of our resources, if we need to do something to assist you, and for some irrational reason we were to say, it could be a rational reason as well, but in these circumstances, irrational, we said no, the Home Secretary can direct me to give you assistance. What the Home Secretary can't do, as set out in the bill, is task us to do a specific operation. And that's because that gets the whole operational independence and responsibility out of kilter any more than a PCC would not task the Chief Constable to undertake a particular operation. That really is the nub of operational independence. Which operations do you start? How do you undertake them? When do you end them? So apart from that one power, it's all reciprocal. And the whole operating model depends on you being able to escalate things to us. That's how we want to work.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more? I know that you're meeting some police and crime commissioners later today, aren't you? You indicated that. Elaborate a little bit more on your relationship, theoretical at the moment anyway, with them once you're elected, and who has the upper hand there?
Well, I think my main relationship at a senior level within policing is with chief constables and the commissioners, not the police and crime commissioners. But I'm increasingly clear that we need to develop a relationship with the PCC, and some of that's in support of the Chief Constable. So I think we've got a responsibility to help the PCC understand the nature of the threats that are impacting on the people to whom they have to account. I think we've got a responsibility to explain why contributing to the national effort is important. And I think I've got a responsibility to set out what difference we're making in their particular area. And I think that's about communication and openness. What I'm really clear about is the most important relationship in a local area is between the PCC and the Chief Constable. So I just need to pick my way through that carefully.
Yeah. It won't be easy, will it?
No.
Gentleman there.
Jim Andronov from West Midlands. So you mentioned that one of the key challenges is around gaining a coherent intelligence picture, both at national and local level. Given the patchwork of 43 odd intelligence systems across the force, would you see a time for a national intelligence system, and how are you going to overcome that challenge?
Of course, in an ideal world, we would have a national intelligence system, but Jim, you and I both know some of the history of IT systems in the police service and trying to get commonality. Interestingly, our colleagues in Scotland have achieved it through the Scottish Intelligence Database. They've achieved a number of things that I think probably we might want to replicate here in England and Wales. So ideally, we'd be operating on the same platform. But the reality is, whether it's willingness of PCCs and chief constables or inability because of funding issues and all the challenges that we all face, that's not going to happen anytime soon. One would hope that it's going to happen in the medium term. In the meantime, we need to make what we've got work better. I think system problems and incompatibility are part of the challenge. I think the bigger challenge is one of culture and determination to share intelligence. And I think if we all collectively demonstrate the leadership to make sure we have a single picture, it's amazing what we can do irrespective of the systems.
Is there a danger that your counter-terrorism role will lead to organised crime taking a bit of a back seat in your operations?
Well, to be clear, we haven't got a counter-terrorism role.
Well, if you did.
We may or may not.
If you did, sorry. Yeah.
I think that is a challenge. We would need to work that through very carefully. There's experience elsewhere. In the US, for instance, there'll be experience after April next year in Scotland, because when they have a single force, they'll have a single directorate that deals with serious organised crime and CT in the same place. So we'll need to work that through and make sure we get a proper balance. Because, of course, there are some huge differences in the threats, and our tolerance of risk is different. We tolerate a level of serious organised crime because the idea of having zero is simply not achievable. But we're talking about at least 30,000 individuals, at least 7,000 organised crime groups. It's a big problem. The people involved in terrorism are fewer, but the impact of what they do is very, very significant, and we have a zero tolerance approach. So there are some very key differences in the nature of the threat and how we would make sure we lined up our resources behind both. But to be clear, we haven't got a role at the moment, and no decision's been made about the future.
You alluded to the problem, or perceived problem anyway, of recruitment and the difficulty, that an understandable difficulty with regard to pensions, people not wishing to forgo, not necessarily forgo them, but affect those. What about recruitment generally? I mean, is it possible there'll be a resistance to leave, well-established, I hesitate to say the word comfortable jobs, but, you know, secure jobs, and take a risk with an agency, given that, you know, so many of these initiatives have, as we've seen, have only lasted for so long and eventually been either changed or scrapped?
I don't think so. I don't think there'll be any shortage of people from law enforcement that want to join us. But of course, if you look at the nature of the threat, it's not just recruiting from our traditional areas of law enforcement anyway. We do need to recruit people off the street, from the private sector, with other skills, because I think the police service, as an example, would not be able to give us the capability we need around cyber and retain a level of capability for itself. We need to think differently about the sort of people we recruit. And we're not recruiting people to be police officers within the NCA, we're recruiting NCA officers. But I do think a lot of the people that I would want to see in the NCA, in addition to the people getting, are in the police service at the moment.
Anybody else got any questions? Oh, yes, sir. Tell us, and gentleman there. Right, you, sir, first.
Hi, Mark.
So,
Questions or ideas, by the way, because Keith's happy to listen to ideas as well, aren't you? Yes, sir.
Mark Turner, West Mercia. Thinking back to when the soccer was arranged and was set up, very soon after was the Closing the Gap issue of regional protective services resources, and that gap was identified. Are you satisfied that there's capacity within the service, within the wider law enforcement, for NCA and regional and local and all the tasking you've talked about?
The short answer is no, I'm not satisfied. That doesn't mean to say it's not there, but one of the things I said when I spoke was I think the biggest challenge and the biggest risk is around the intelligence hub. I think the second biggest challenge and risk is around the capability that sits within wider law enforcement. And I think there are some very real challenges there, particularly at a time when you're all experiencing budget reductions. I think it's really important that chief constables and commissioners help PCCs understand that if you want less burglary, antisocial behaviour and violence, it isn't just about visibility on the streets, it's also about what we do elsewhere. And I think nailing that very clearly is hugely important.
You happy with that, sir?
Thank you.
Next customer. Thank you.
Carl Smetham, Derbyshire. You talked about engagement with the communities. In the East Midlands, we've got a regional capacity that the public don't understand now. How do you think you're going to engage with communities from your level to make them understand how you fit within the law enforcement jigsaw that you were describing?
Well, I don't see us necessarily in the way that you would in Derbyshire or the way that MSU would, engaging directly in the way that you would seek to do that. I think, you know, at a force level, you're much better at that than we should be, and I'm not sure what value it would add. The level of engagement I'm talking about is people knowing who we are and what we do, and understanding how we work with MSU and Derbyshire Police to deliver protection for them. And some of that's about people having the confidence to come forward and report what happens to them, to be witnesses, to be confident they're not going to get targeted, and all of that. I think people need to understand who we are. And it also plays into our ability to recruit. It plays into the nature of our relationship with Derbyshire Police, that communities know who we are and what we do, and that we're visibly in support of Derbyshire Police. So I don't see us going to community meetings in the way that you would, but our visibility and the public consciousness of what we do needs to be of a different order than what's gone before.
If you had a sort of 30-second commercial to sort of, as you might have to explain to the nation ultimately when this is up and running, what would be the sort of 100 words you'd use to describe it, what you do? To Joe public, or Joe or Josephine public, who say, national what? I never heard of that. How do you sum it up in 30 seconds, what you do? To actually answer the point made by our friend from Derbyshire.
I didn't think you would give me a low baller like that, John. My pitch would be the things that people see outside their front door, whether it's gun crime, drug dealing, whether it's their house getting broken into, whether it's concerned about the safety of their children on the internet. All of those threats cannot be tackled by effective law enforcement and partnership within neighbourhoods alone. The reality is much of that threat, much of that damage starts hundreds or thousands of miles away and does not respect any of the boundaries that we think historically might have protected us. We need a national agency that helps local law enforcement and partnerships be better at protecting the public.
Good. I'd understand that. I think it's a good message, yeah. Someone down there, tell us who you are.
Good morning, my name's Steve Ratcliffe from the Metropolitan Police. I'm just wondering how realistic is your hope that you were only an extremist task other forces. I can understand the attractiveness of that phrase to you when you're trying to get legislation through Parliament and when you're negotiating with chief constables, but there's going to be a huge incentive for other forces when they see your remit just to say, over to you, mate. And you're not going to be sufficient size or have the resources to be able to deal with all those problems without tasking forces. I hope there's a question coming at the end of this. But do you think that the embarrassment to a force of being tasked by the National Crime Agency will be what the forces are trying to avoid? Or do you really think that you're going to have a long time, mature relationship with police and crime commissioners and chief constables commissioners that's going to mean you do not have to task other forces?
One of the things that I've disagreed with some colleagues, it's only been a few, is if you used organised crime group mapping as an example. Some colleagues have proposed that when you've mapped the groups and you look at the top right-hand corner in the matrix, which are the most risky and most intense, why don't we have a process that says that's over to the NCA? I absolutely don't agree with that and could not operate in that way. And that's partly because that would give us a level of ownership of organised crime groups that's beyond the capacity of our agency and beyond the capacity of any law enforcement agency in the UK. But more importantly, that takes no account of who is best to lead that particular response. So if one of those risky groups, that is the sort of territory we need to be operating in, but if one of those groups is perhaps living in Spain, strong links because of drug markets into South Africa and back into the UK, I could see why NCA might be the best organisation to take the lead on that, supported by forces and agencies in the UK, but also supported by international law enforcement. If that highly risky and capable organised crime group are running around the streets of South London with a gun, I'm not sure that we're the best people to tackle that. I suspect the Metropolitan Police would be the best people to tackle that group. So one of the things I want us to avoid, which I think has happened a little bit in our history, is pass the parcel. I don't think that's helpful. I think this is about us joining up across organisational boundaries rather than trying to get to a point where it's yours and it's not mine. I don't think that's helpful at all, and I don't think the vast majority of colleagues across the service think that's helpful. You described what I said as a hope. It's more than a hope, it's a judgment, because like you, like everyone in this room, chief constables and police and crime commissioners, I believe, come to work to protect the public. That's what we all get out of bed for. That's why we come to work. That's why we do the jobs that we do. My responsibility is to explain very clearly the nature of the threat, how we need to prioritise our activity, and on occasions, all of us might need to be able to say we just can't do that for very rational reasons. I think directed tasking is an unreasonable refusal to a compelling case for action. I think it's right in the extreme because resources aren't limitless, and this is absolutely not about me or someone else deciding about how we move law enforcement's assets around the country. It's more about making sure we've got the right ownership and we're all contributing our bit as part of a collective response. But to be clear, the reason I think we need the power is if we can't deliver that, then we will need to decide, and if I need to use the power, then I will.
And can I just be absolutely clear, Keith? I mean, the two examples you drew there, one of the drugs ring operating in foreign countries, South Africa, etc., and or the gun hoodlums in South London, the decision on whether or not you get involved, is that purely your call?
Yes, but, and there's a couple of people in this room who are involved in it, we're adopting many of the decision-making processes that the police use to make our decision-making very predictable. So, come back to our colleague's point from the Met, there will be, if we talk about organised crime groups, there will be features of some organised crime groups that suggest it's more of an NCA issue than a local law enforcement issue. So, international reach, or if they've corrupted local law enforcement, for instance. You start to feel, if these are really dangerous groups, that feels like NCA need to be leading on this, rather than some of the other characteristics. So I'm working with police and law enforcement to develop the way in which we'll make those decisions. We're not going to do it in isolation, in some anonymous place. We're going to make those decisions with wider law enforcement, but decide we will. And like every agency represented here, we'll have to decide where we're going to use our resources for best effect.
Are you happy, sir? I've got one over there and then one later. This one first has been waiting a bit longer. Yes, sir. Oh, off you go.
Sean Wilson, Met Police. You talked about PCCs and relationships with chief constables. In terms of corporate governance, how do you see the NCA being held to account?
Well, that's not for me, but I can tell you what's proposed. One of the lessons, I guess, as chiefs we've all learnt as we've gone through the Police and Crime Commissioner debate is to make sure on the right side of the argument. And I think being given the powers that we've been given and we're entrusted with, it's not for us to say how we should be called to account. It is for us to help shape that, and we do need to understand how it's going to work. And what's proposed in the bill at the moment is it's a one-to-one relationship between myself with operational independence to the Home Secretary. There's other provisions in the bill, such as a framework document about how we would engage other partners, other agencies, those with a stake in NCA to help us make all the right decisions. Each of the commands within the NCA will have a strategic governance group where they meet with partners to help work through what our priorities are. And there's particular responsibilities on me. For instance, in Scotland, I have to consult government in Scotland about operational priorities, and I need to consult partners in England and Wales about operational priorities. But I think it's important for the Home Secretary that we have the one-to-one relationship versus, at the moment, if you use soccer as an example, there's a statutory board between the Home Secretary and the Director General, and that's absolutely not what she wants.
You happy, sir? We've got one more here. Tell us who you are, sir.
Mark Jackson from the Met Police. If I can just touch on something you mentioned about activity in transit and source countries, which was very much the pitch soccer made when they were created, and may well be part of the contribution to why they lack visibility. How will you ensure when activity does take place out in source countries, you don't lose that accountability, that visibility that you've talked around with PCCCs and communities?
It's interesting, isn't it, that when an organisation is going, it's very easy for people to think that everything that's gone before is bad, and that's absolutely not the reality. What I know, and maybe you know as well, but I hear it on a weekly basis at the moment, is the very high esteem that our international partners hold soccer in for the work that they do. I've even had lobbying from some countries not to rebrand Soccer International as part of NCA because relationships are so strong and our international partners depend so much on the very good work they do. Frankly, I think it's been a real success story. The difficulty is, don't be surprised if your success doesn't get acknowledged if you don't tell people about it. You need to tell people what you're doing well. You also need to be as candid about the things you're not doing so well. That's the nature of life. You've got to be open and transparent. I think we need to be better at explaining the very good work that soccer do. It wouldn't be appropriate here, but some of you will know about this. Some of the very sensitive, difficult operations they're involved in, frankly, are at the high end of law enforcement and will be very, very difficult for anyone to undertake. And I don't want to lose that. But I do, to the extent that's appropriate, need to make that more visible to law enforcement because I think that's one of the jewels in the crown that we're inheriting, and I want to make sure we do it well.
Right, one more over there. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Chris Harden from West Yorkshire. I've got, I think, 3 questions, really. First of all is about budget. You've talked about the savings that we're going to have to be making. What is your budget, or will it be, and how's it been set, and how's it being funded? How many staff will you have within that budget to operate across not just this England and Wales, but also overseas, as you said? Is there a firearms capability you'll have with that as well, or do forces provide that firearms capability for you? And also, you've talked about regions. Define a region, because we've got the ACPO regions, but I know sort of from West Yorkshire, quite a lot of our work at serious and organised crime level is with Greater Manchester Police, with Merseyside Police, and also with South Yorkshire Police as well, and none of those, apart from South Yorkshire, really fall within what we call a traditional region for us. We're also doing quite a lot of work across the Yorkshire and Humber region as well, and I'm sure other forces are having different agreements with other forces that don't really fall within any of what you'd call an ACPO region.
I think that was 4 questions.
How many? 4 too, yeah.
Okay.
Budget, staff.
The final 4 questions.
Okay. Budget. My assumption is our starting budget will be the post-spending review budgets of all the precursors. That means it's just under £500 million as a starting point. That said, what I've also been pretty clear about is where we inherit additional responsibilities, that's got to come with a level of resource, otherwise we're just spreading what we've already got more thinly. So that's the starting assumption. There's all sorts of ways you could model that. You know, you'll know from managing your own budgets, you could argue it's about 450 million, but the operating assumption, it's the budgets of the precursors. In terms of how many staff we'll have, that depends on how we decide to spend our money. But in terms of number of people that we're working for us, rather than number of posts on day one, there's just over 4,000 people from the precursors that we know of at the moment that will come and join us. Firearms, soccer have a very, very good firearms capability. I don't want to share too much of that openly. I can do it with you one-to-one, but they have a very good capability that's been deployed in support of many forces that are within this room, and I don't see us denuding that in any way. I think that's something that's been particularly welcome. In terms of regions, you said what I choose to call, it's not me, they're ACPO regions. I think our partnership with the police service as a whole is our most important partnership, and the police service is configured around a set of regions at the moment that are called ACPO regions. I've asked the questions of the leaders of the service, how do you want us to interact? I've got an answer. In the spirit of partnership and co-creation, that's how I intend to interact as a starting point. If it doesn't work, I'll come back and we'll do something different, but that's where we're going to start from.
Any more? If not, would you like to show your appreciation to Keith? Thank you very much indeed. Very amazing.